Alrighty, so today we're going to be looking at the American Civil War, and we're going to be looking at the causes of it, which I think we already know sort of by this point, having looked at the different events leading up to today's course and today and to the readings for today. But the American Civil War begins, I guess, officially, let's say, in April of 1861. However, the years, the year ahead of that, I think, or the years heading up to that, we know that the tensions had been rising throughout, the country and different debates over the sort of where slavery will happen and things like that. And then when Lincoln wins the election in November of 1860, that begins a real major question for the country, right? And then in December of 1860 that South Carolina secedes from the United States. And then we also know that Lincoln obviously is still going to become president, and Lincoln wins the election with no Southern support, right? So we know that all these different tensions are rising, and then sort of the worst possible thing that could happen for the South is Lincoln getting elected. South Carolina secedes, and then others follow suit, right? So before Lincoln even is inaugurated, and there's a map in your book that'll show you this, right? That there's, 6 states that are already seceded before Lincoln's even inaugurated. And then Lincoln is inaugurated, right? And his first address, as I say here, is his inaugural address is an address that sort of says, look, we're trying to keep the country together. We're trying to bring the country back together. But if the South is the country that provokes this, or the South is the side that provokes this, then we will be the ones who will have to go back to fighting, right? And there's a document that we're going to look at to help illustrate that. Now, when the war does ultimately break out in April of 1861 with the attack on Fort Sumter, both sides have their advantages and their disadvantages. For the North, their advantage is population. The North is tremendous in terms of population. They outnumber the South about 2.5 to 1. And not only that, they also have huge manufacturing, right? 92% of the manufacturing is in the North. Transportation, raw materials, they are stacked. Now, the other piece to this, though, is that the South has their advantages. And the South also, the Southern advantage is that the fighting is going to be happening in the South. The fighting is going to be happening on Southern home territory. So that when, a defensive war is far easier to win. You basically just have to wear the other person out. You basically create a war of attrition. The other piece to this is that the South has a far better military, right? In the South, there had been a long tradition of military prowess, and the South had developed a much stronger military culture. Young boys are on their horses, learning to shoot, learning to fight from a very young age. They're going north to West Point. They're going to other military academies, so that the South has this huge advantage, right? And the person who becomes the general of the Southern Army, General Robert E. Lee, graduated first in his class from West Point. So you can see that there's this huge advantage the South has. So we know that the war breaks out with the attack of Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina, and this is really, this is the thing that sort of precipitates the fighting. So I want to then turn our attention to what does the North do, as again, they are the ones who have to invade the South. What is their strategy to win the war? And the strategy that they come up with is what's called the Anaconda Plan. This is basically starve out the South. Use your superior navy and your superior resources to starve out the South. Blockade southern ports, blockade the Gulf of Mexico, and most importantly, get your hands on the Mississippi River. And once you can do that, now you can start to sort of starve out the South. Now, this is a very costly type of strategy, right? Because it's going to take all of your naval resources, right? So now you can't sort of defend the coast that you would want to with your navy. But this is also a strategy that is going to be extremely resource heavy, because you're going to need to send your navy very thin across the whole Atlantic Ocean. Then you're going to have to keep refueling them, right? Because they're surrounding hostile territory. So this is going to be a really tough thing to do. The Mississippi River, right? Half of it is in the north, half is in the south. So you also need to flood that region to try and get that control, right? So this is an extremely risky endeavor. The border states are also really important, right? So we know that the Deep South has seceded Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. But those states that are in the middle, right? Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware are states that still have slavery, but they are along the sort of north-south divide. And Lincoln is really sort of honing in on them, right? So Missouri winds up staying with the North. Kentucky winds up staying with the North. Virginia split. So you have a North Virginia, you have a West Virginia, and just Virginia. And West Virginia stays with the North. Maryland stays with the North, and so does Delaware. Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, these other border states, wind up seceding and join the Confederacy. Kentucky is extremely important, right? Because now you can still travel, safely along the border, along those border states to the Mississippi River, because that's another piece of the Mississippi River, right? If you don't, Kentucky sort of leads into the river. If you don't have that, you don't have access to the river. So it's an important piece of territory. Okay. So with all these strategies going on, the South also has a strategy, and the Southern strategy is basically don't surrender. Just keep fighting, and don't give in to the North. If we can sort of hold out, we will have continued resources. We will wind up beating the North. Although the South had their strategies of trying to demoralize the North and basically just not surrender, the South also had a huge number of sort of other problems. The South depended so much on cotton and agricultural products, right? But as the war is going on, the economy of the South crumbles, right? They create their own currency, which is a sort of farce currency. But they also, can't produce as much cotton as they need to be successful. The British sort of knowing the British, who had been the South's sort of largest, purchaser, now is not really in the need for the British, for the cotton from the South. Particularly also because they knew the war was coming, so they sort of stocked up on Southern cotton. So the cotton prices go down. For the North, on the other hand, things are going very well for the North. In terms of production, right? Everything goes into the war. And basically there's just tremendous amounts of production in the North trying to beat the South. So as the war is going on, Lincoln, just to sort of talk briefly about his presidency, we have a very good opinion of Lincoln, right? Lincoln is the man who sort of kept the Union together, but he did so at any cost necessary, right? One of the things that Lincoln famously does is he suspends habeas corpus. He suspends due process, right? He basically says that he can arrest you for any reason and keep you as long as possible. Because of that, he passes the first income tax, right? I mean, he does so many things that that are sort of huge economic concerns to the country, big pieces to the economy that others would be scoffed at, right? But in the time of war, it gives him the ability to do this. So let's then just talk about sort of the end of the war. One of the things that is important to see here, so the end of the war, really the turning point of the war, I think most of us know, at least I hope, is the Battle of Gettysburg, right? So in July of 1863, you have, so the Battle of Gettysburg, July 1st to the 3rd, 1863, is a huge fight, right? It's the only north battle that happens north of the Mason-Dixon in Pennsylvania, and it is a huge success for the North, right? The South really throws everything it can get at the North. Sort of famous Pickett's Charge is on the third day, July 3rd, where George Pickett and his army invade across a massive open field on the Northern Army, and they're just demolished, right? The South is forced to retreat. Now, the big really piece of this, the sort of thing that really sort of solidifies the Northern advantage here, is the next day, right? July 4th, 1863, is the successful completion of the siege of Vicksburg. So Vicksburg is a town on the Mississippi River, and when the North can win in Vicksburg, what happens is you have the North now controlling the Mississippi River, and that sort of completes the plan, right? So now it just becomes an all-out siege of the South. And famously, General Sherman, General Tecumseh Sherman, has his march to the sea, right? So basically he starts in eastern Tennessee and basically just starts marching through Georgia. And he basically winds up just destroying huge numbers of territory in the South, right? He basically burns towns, farms, plantations, kills animals. The purpose here is two things: destroy anything the South can use and destroy Southern morale. Finally, we get, Lincoln gets reelected in the election of 1864. And finally, the war ends in April of 1865. General Grant is forced to surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. The South has been demoralized. They have been defeated. General Grant had taken over. Ulysses S. Grant, who would later become president, had taken over as commander of the army, and he is forced. He takes Lee's surrender. I think we all know that Abraham Lincoln is the first president of the United States to be assassinated, and he is assassinated days after the end of the war, and on April 14th, 1865. These events are extremely important, right? So what is, I've run down basically the war, right? What's important to notice here is that the North and the South were fairly evenly matched, right? One had a better military strength. One had a better industrial strength. But in a war of attrition, that's really the important piece, right? Resources are the thing that's going to win you a war of attrition. No matter how great your military is, if you don't have the goods to back it up, you're just not going to win a war. And at the end of the day, that's really what helped the North. So finally, over 600,000 people die. Obviously, nearly all of those soldiers, unlike in other wars like World War I or World War II, where you can have a large civilian death. The civilian death here in the American Civil War is not that great. The cost is extreme, right? $15 billion, which is a huge sum of money. And all of these things are drains on the country, right? So how is the country going to reconstruct? How is the country going to come back together? And that'll be the topic of our last piece here. Thanks. Take care.